I'm Elizabeth at Literary Princess, and today I am talking about what I am teaching in British Literature 3. So, if you haven't seen my first video on my romantics unit, I highly suggest you go and watch that because I give some introduction about what this course is. But today I'm talking about my unit on the Victorians, which naturally is my favorite unit. And I had a really great time teaching my students this. First day was just an introduction lecture, and then the next day we got into the actual literature. And I organized this very thematically, so our conversation this day was on industrialization and the city. So I had them read from Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poem, The Cry of the Children, which I'll put something up here because I don't have anything. I have Aurora Lee, but I'm not gonna hold that up right now. So this is a poem written in basically condemning child labor. I then had them read a selection from London Labor and the London Poor by Henry Mayhew, which was a nonfiction account of poor people in London. And then I had them read a brief selection from Hard Times by Charles Dickens, which was describing Coketown. So we talked about, all right, what's our impression of the city? These authors think industrialization is a good thing, a bad thing? Would you want to live in Coketown? Everyone was like, no, because the river is literally black. So that day we had a presentation by one of my students on the author Israel Zangwill, who's a Jewish author. He wrote The Children of the Ghetto, which is about city life of the Jewish population of London. Next class, we moved on to Domesticity, Realism, and the novel. Had them read chapter 17 of Adam Bede, in which the story pauses a little. And this can be considered George Eliot's manifesto on realism. So I wanted them to get a sense of that. She talks about trying to portray things as they are, not as we would like them to be. She also compares it to Dutch paintings, which she considers very realistic. So we had the conversation of, so is this actually fully realistic? We looked at some of the paintings, and then we talked about what are we seeing in this section of Adam Bede, and how realism is a very loose term in the Victorian era. I suppose pretty much all Victorian literature can be considered realist fiction to some degree, but everybody has different levels of realism. So we discussed that. I then also had them read Eliot's essay, Silly Novels by Lady Novelists, in which she complains about women's fiction being unrealistic and melodramatic. So they got a hoot out of that because they were like, she's really harsh. Like, yeah, she is. And then we also read one chapter of Sketches by Boz by Charles Dickens. It was a Christmas dinner to look at Dickens' idea of realism, but also this idea of domesticity and the family that was so important to the Victorians and that we see again and again in Victorian literature. On this day, we had a presentation on Margaret Oliphant, one of my favorite realist domestic novelists of the time. The next class was titled Art, the Artist, and the Pre-Raphaelites. So this was just my way of getting some more poetry in there. First, we read Alfred Tennyson's The Lady of Shalott, which I do have in this book, even though it's Idylls of the King. It also has selections of other poems. So The Lady of Shalott, inspired the Pre-Raphaelites so heavily. So we looked at the paintings, of course, but also it's frequently read as a depiction of the artist and what needs to be done to create art, and then how the viewer looks at art once it's done and doesn't really understand everything that went into it, with the last line being Sir Lancelot being like, oh, she has a pretty face, when she has literally died to get there. So we read that. And then we read 2 poems by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, both called The Portrait. One is a sonnet from The House of Life, and then one is a longer poem. They are both dealing with the same thing, which is him painting his wife, Elizabeth Siddal. And we were all a bit like, this is a little bit creepy. And he's very much idealizing her. And this idea that she will live on through his painting, but all other men will have to access her through him. So that was very interesting. And then in contrast, we have Christina Rossetti's poem In an Artist's Studio, which is commenting on her brother, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, painting all these portraits of Elizabeth Siddal. And her being like, you're kind of a creep, bro. Everyone really loved Christina Rossetti. And then also, just for fun, we read at the end of class her poem, No Thank You, John, which is a dramatic monologue of a woman just repeatedly refusing to marry a man, and they adored that. So they were very into Christina Rossetti. On this day, we did have a presentation on Elizabeth Siddal, because not only was she a pre-Raphaelite model, she was also an artist and a poet herself. Next, we did Empire and Colonization, because you can't have the Victorian era without the British Empire. So for these, I gave them 3 things. And what I really wanted to show them was the attitudes of people toward this idea of colonization and toward people from these colonies. So we looked at Rudyard Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden, which is, yikes, let's just say. It's urging the United States to get in on this, on colonization, and saying that it's like, it's not because we're getting any gain out of it, it's for helping these poor, savage countries. Like, it's really gross, and that is what I wanted my students to get out of it, the fact that this attitude was really gross. Also read from J.A. Hobson some selections from Imperialism, a Study, and Hobson was more not on board with imperialism. He thought that the British government was saying, we're doing this to teach them how to rule themselves, but then they weren't really doing that. So this was kind of an opposite opinion to Kipling. Read selections from T.M. Mukherjee's A Visit to Europe. So Mukherjee, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, I'm sorry, was an Indian man who came to visit Europe and England, and he was writing his impressions and how people treated him. So that was very interesting for everyone to compare. Our next class was on the woman question. So we read a selection from Coventry Patmore's poem, The Angel in the House. We read specifically the section called The Paragon, and everyone was like, yikes. This is Patmore's idea of this very idealized domestic goddess, almost, this angel of the house. And that has become what we call the Victorian ideal of woman. And obviously it's creepy and uncomfortable. We then read a selection from John Stuart Mill's The Subjection of Women, which is arguing that basically he compares the way British women are treated to slavery. He's like, this is the only form of slavery still accepted in the British Empire. And he argues that they need better education, they need rights, they need to be able to own property. So basically decrying this whole idea of the angel in the house and being like, no, that's no good. And then we also read a selection from Mona Caird's Marriage, which is an article in which she is basically decrying the institution of marriage as it is in England at the time. So for our presentation that day, we had Sarah Grant, who wrote New Women Fiction. Her most famous one is The Heavenly Twins. we went on to our novel, which was, of course, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. All my tabs with all my places that I wanted them to look at. So this combined a lot of the stuff we were talking about, the woman question, domesticity, and realism, but it also harkens back to the Gothic from the previous unit of the Romantics. And then, of course, there is empire and colonization here because Bertha Mason is from the West Indies. My students had such a good time with this, okay? Only one of them had read it before. And most of them opted to literally read it as we went. So we had 3 classes on it over the course of a week. The first class, we talked about volume 1, second class, volume 2, third class, volume 3. And most of them opted to read it like that. So they read volume 1 for class on Monday and then read volume 2 for Wednesday. So I just got this real-time reaction to these students' first time reading Jane Eyre. And it was great. Oh my God. So the first volume, I was like, okay, what do y'all think so far? And they're like, yeah, okay, very descriptive. It's good. It's fine. And then we come to class on Wednesday. They're all like, what the hell? Guy has a woman locked up in the attic. What is this? They were like, oh my God, their minds were blown. It was so good. I loved watching it. And then, of course, with volume 3, they get everything with St. John Rivers and then Jane going back to Rochester. Spoilers for Jane Eyre, by the way. And they were loving it. They were so into it. They all loved Jane as a character. They were all they had feelings about Rochester. They were like, this guy's a creep. But also we kind of want the romance to work because he's better than St. John. And then I just loved seeing it. We talked about the ending and whether this is a betrayal of Jane's previous wish for independence and liberty, or whether it's conforming to Victorian ideals of domesticity. We talked about Bronte's use of the Gothic, especially with the Bertha Mason scenes. We also talked about some of the more autobiographical portions of the book. Lowood, of course, I gave them a lecture on Charlotte Bronte's background, which basically just had them all like, this is really depressing. I'm like, yeah, I'm sorry. But so we talked about why would she choose to include Lowood in this and why include something so autobiographical in a book that otherwise isn't really about her life, even though she does use some things. We also talked about Mr. Rochester being a kind of version of Constantine Heger, who was Charlotte's French teacher, who she was in love with, but also him as a Byronic hero. And that's because, of course, we just did Byron. And we just did Frankenstein, where everyone was like, Frankenstein is Byron. And we're all like, yeah, okay, fair. And they were all like, Rochester's just Byron. I'm like, yeah, kind of. Fair enough. But they had so much fun, and I had so much fun teaching this to them. When we got back from break, they did turn in their essays on the Victorians, and they had 3 possible prompts. So as in the Romantics video, I will share with the prompts with you. Number 1, with the expansion of the British Empire and the Industrial Revolution, the Victorian period is often considered an era of great progress. However, people both at the time and in the present have questioned whether these events could be considered a decline instead. Examine 2 texts we have read in relation to one of these 2 issues. Do the authors consider it progress or decline? Prompt 2. Choose 2 poems out of the ones we've read by Tennyson, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and Christina Rossetti. How do the poets represent the relationship between the artist, the subject, and the viewer? How are the 2 portrayals similar and or different? How could this connect to the Victorian ideals and issues we have discussed? And prompt number 3, how does the ending of Jane Eyre conform to the Victorian ideal of domesticity? Is this at odds with Jane's earlier wish for liberty and independence? Do you ultimately consider this a happy ending? Keep in mind, there is no right answer. The Ferndean question is something scholars have argued about for decades. I just want to hear your take on it. So they had their essays due Monday night. So I'm filming on Tuesday, so it was last night. So I just did a quick flip through to see which ones people were writing about. And there's a pretty even mix of people writing about each of the 3 prompts. So I am so excited to read them. I was so impressed with their essays on the Romantics, and I can't wait. I'm super excited. So that is what I was teaching in British Literature 3 for the Victorians. Next up, we are going to have the Modernists. We just started those on Monday, and on Wednesday, we will be talking about the World War I poets. So please stay tuned for that. Let me know down in the comments below. What do you think of my syllabus for this unit? Have you read any of these? What did you think of them? What did you take in a class on Victorian literature? It has been great chatting with you. I will see you soon. Bye.